Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terraced hideout in northern Nigeria. And I have a guest with me who apparently has also been kidnapped by ISIS, judging by by his background. It's my very good friend Rod Dreher. How are you, Rod?
I'm doing well, Peg. Thanks for having me on. And in fact, I am hiding out upstairs in my Budapest lair because the cleaning lady is downstairs.
That that's actually acceptable. So basically, you have a new book coming out. I mean, there's a million things we could talk about. I've read your stuff since, God, I don't know when, maybe, 15 years at least.
Wow. Yeah. I'm
Um,
old, man. I'm really old.
we're both getting old. So we could talk about a million things, but let's talk about your book. You always come out with very interesting books, very books that have unusual angles, books that become memes. Like how many people who talk about the X option on Twitter, the whatever, know that it actually comes from a book by Rod Dreher. I don't know. So your latest book is called Living in Wonder. So tell us what the book is and what it's about.
Well, the book is about Christian re-enchantment, about re-enchantment generally, but specifically about Christian re-enchantment. What do I mean by that? Well, everybody knows the Max Weber thesis that in the modern world has
Not
become.
everybody knows, actually.
Okay, all right, well, let's tell them. Max Weber was a great sociologist, early 20th century, late 19th, and who said that the modern world has become disenchanted. What he meant by that was that people no longer are conscious in ways they were in the past of the presence of spirit everywhere. And, we've become much more materialistic, scientific, technological, that sort of thing. And he came at it from a sociological perspective. And I think he was generally right, although it's a good question about whether the world can ever be fully disenchanted. In any case, I think that is generally true. I mean, as you well know, because we've talked about it for over the years, I'm a big fan of Michel Welbeck, the French novelist, and I think he is a diagnostician of secularism, of a world without God and without spirit, though he's not a religious person himself. And I didn't set out to write a trilogy with the Benedict option 2017, Live Not by Lies 2020, and now Living in Wonder, but that's kind of how it's shaken out because the problem that concerns me most of all intellectually is what does it mean to be a Christian in a post Christian civilization, our own? And Benedict option was about the what I think is the imperative for Christians to form smaller communities of faith, not to withdraw from the world and head for the hills. We can't do that. That's just not even possible today. But to make ourselves go deeper in the faith and be more resilient, so that when we are face the post-Christian world, we can be faithful. Live Not by Lies came out at the height of COVID and after the summer of George Floyd. And it's about the warnings that people who live through Christians and others but mostly Christians who lived through communism, Soviet communism, the warnings they had for us in the West about the totalitarian nature of wokeness and managerial liberalism. And in fact, that's about to be a documentary film that's coming out April 1st from Angel Studios. We went into the former Eastern Bloc and talked to some of these Christians. And so, what that book was, in terms of my own interest, was about the particular nature of the kind of totalitarianism we were living through. Now, this final book is about it's at the heart of the project, which is to say, I don't believe that the Christian faith will recover until and unless we revitalize it with re-enchantment, by which I mean we find ways to make the faith live not just as a set of ideas or a set of social practices, but as a way of connecting with God. I mean, Marshall McLuhan, the great media theorist, was a daily mass going Catholic, and he once said that people make in the modern times think that religion is concept, not percept. By percept, he meant the things that we take in with our senses. The sensory information that comes into our brains, maybe the right hemisphere gets sent over to the left for analysis, and but we get stuck in the left brain, and religion becomes a set of propositions. Um, well, I say that McLuhan said that if religion becomes concept and we lose the perceptive aspect of it, then the faith will die. He said that everybody he knows who lost their faith did so first by ceasing to pray, and that's the main perceptive way. So that sounds very, very abstract, but
No, that's fascinating, actually.
well, I'll tell you that there's a French aspect here too. The genesis of the book, I think, came from when I
Mais
read.
oui.
Yeah, when I read Welbeck's Submission, the novel he's probably best known for in America, in which it's about set in a France in the near future. France is about to go Islamist, and the main character Francois, he's this dissolute Sorbonne professor who is trying to decide whether or not he should conform to the coming Islamist order and secure his job and maybe get some extra wives, or if maybe he can recover his Christian past. So in the in the book, he goes down to Rocamadour, the medieval pilgrimage site for French Catholics. He goes in there looking for re-enchantment. He hears them, the worshippers singing Taizé chant, and he starts to have a numinous experience. He starts to feel like maybe God is here. Then he catches himself and says, "No, no, no! This must be something I ate." He goes out, goes back to Paris, does
This is
this.
very Welbeck. I haven't read Submission,
You
by the
haven't?
way.
Well, I've ruined it for you now, but it's been out for 10 years.
Well,
So
I mean, I know the plot. Like, if real literature novels are not about the plot. I've read other Welbecks, but I haven't read that one.
okay,
But that's
but he
very
makes
well.
this decision to refuse this numinous experience and goes back to Paris and makes a cynical conversion to Islam. I wrote this book in part for people like Francois was standing at the threshold of faith in the church. He has an experience of wonder, but he lacks the courage to act on it. I wrote Living in Wonder in part for men and women like him who sense that there must be something beyond the material world, but they lack the courage to act on that.
That's great. By the way, about Welbeck, so I have no non-public information. I don't know him. People assume that French people all know each other, and that's actually mostly true. Because the French quote unquote elite is a very small world. But I don't know Welbeck. But there's something I noticed, and so this is public. I'm going to talk about it, but nobody else seems to have noticed this. So it was a few years ago, either just before or during the pandemic, and he was invited to receive an award in Belgium. I'm forgetting the concept. I'm just bringing it up because you mentioned him. Um, and he gives a speech, and he's kind of a recluse, so it's kind of weird that he's coming to accept this award in Belgium. Nobody in France cares about Belgium. And his speech is about the status of Christianity in Europe and like the future of Christianity in Europe. And he gives the speech, and it's interesting, blah blah blah. And throughout the speech, when he talks about Christians, he uses the third person. He says Christians have these problems, blah blah. This is what happened to Christians, blah blah blah. For 90% of the speech, and then the last 10%, still speaking about Christians, he switches to the second person. He says "we"
Mm,
when speaking about Christians in Europe. And obviously, that's not a coincidence.
right.
He's a talented writer, and I mean, they public like nobody seems to have noticed this. Like they published the text of the speech, and like none of the coverages. Like
Interesting.
apparently, people didn't read it or didn't pay attention or whatever. I'm not aware that he made any further sort of, statement saying I'm a Christian. Um, and again, he's a pretty recluse guy. He doesn't like talking to the media. He doesn't like seeing people he doesn't already know. Um, so who knows? But I
But
thought I thought that was fascinating, and I thought the fact that nobody picked up on that was also fascinating, but about something else.
Yeah, well, he's written before about how he's a Kantian. You know, he believes with Auguste Comte that you cannot have a society without some religious basis, without there being some uh, generally shared belief that society is grounded in transcendence. Now, Philip Reeve, the American sociologist and cultural critic, was an unbelieving Jew, but he believed the same thing. And he talks in his cultural theory, Reeve talks about his theory of worlds. The first world in Reeve's scheme was the world of ancient paganism. The second world was monotheism. The third world, which is what we live in now in Reeve's model, is a world that no longer makes reference to transcendence, to a transcendent source of morality. It has become instead a world dominated by the therapeutic mode. You've heard of his great 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. What he meant by that
Right.
is in the 20th century, and of course now, uh, we in the West have gone, we've ceased to believe in overarching narratives, the biblical narrative that calls us out of ourselves and which gives us a moral framework by which to judge ourselves. And instead, we've embraced a mode of existence which is always shifting, but it's a way of living that that places well-being at the top of our scale, and we seek rather than to seek to live by some sense of prophetic morality and a God or whatever. We just want to get through the day. Whatever works to allay our anxieties is sufficient. Reeve said, you can't have a civilization that way. He said that we don't know of any civilization in history that has been able to sustain itself without transcendence. Now, this matters a lot to me, not only as an American, but especially as an American living in Europe. I'm in Hungary, in Budapest, and Viktor Orban, the controversial leader of Hungary, has said openly that Europe will not survive unless it recovers its Christian faith. And I mean, he's doing what he can as a politician to make that happen, but there's not a lot you can do as a politician. And he said too, and this really impressed me when I read this speech he gave. He said, people look to me, a politician, for meaning. I can't give them meaning. I can give them things, by which I take it that he means like subsidies or passing laws to make it possible for churches, religious schools, families to thrive. He said that if those institutions, again, churches, schools, families, whatever, the ones that do provide meaning or access to meaning, if they don't step into the space that politicians provide for them to thrive, then all the work we do as politicians, it's in vain. This is an existential question for Europe right now, and lesser for America, but also for America. We see among us here in Europe the power of Islam, and you can't fight something with nothing. I don't know what, absent Christianity, I don't know what Europe uses to resist the power of Islam. Well, I mean, what do you think about this? I think you probably had some thoughts about it.
I mean, I'm a European Christian. I'm a French Catholic. I obviously completely agree with that. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know how to put it, but there's a kind of blindness. So the observation you make is sort of obvious. It's obvious at the sort of historical, sociological level. Like every great civilization has believed in some sort of absolute that it sort of tries to reach for, and this is what motivates them to, build cathedrals and whatever, do all of the great things that great civilizations do. And it's also an obvious observation at the individual level, which is that we all know that, we're going to die. And if all we are atoms and cells and all that, then there's literally no point to anything else. Like, I mean, this is, people mock the sort of post-war French philosophers for talking about suicide all the time, especially Camus. But like, they're just being logical. They're just following the logical chain uh, all the way through. When Camus says, if God doesn't exist, then the single important question is the question of suicide,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is, if there's no transcendent meaning and order, then you know what's the point of life? And if there's no point to life, then why not just end it? Um, and and of course, Camus gives his sort of existentialist answer, which in my view is the sort of most convincing version of this. And obviously, people can judge how convincing it is. And of course, in his personal life, this is something that people don't talk about, but Camus was a very sort of God haunted person. He was sort of like always on the threshold of converting. He had this priest who was a close friend of his, who he sort of like kept, talking to about faith. And Camus died tragically in a car accident, and that priest said, that he was convinced that he would eventually have converted if he lived. So but so these are sort of obvious things, and yet there's a lot of people who have this sort of blindness to it. Like, they sort of look at you um sort of blankly. And I'm talking about the like people who are, again, it's not that I hate this word, it's overused, but people who are in the leads, people who run our societies,
Right,
like,
right.
you know surely you don't want France to turn into a Sharia state. Oh, no, 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 no. And in private, they all acknowledge how bad the situation is
Right.
with Islam, and that there are enclaves that are basically run according to Sharia law, and that they're growing, and that if nothing is done, then that's where we're going to end up. Not on the accelerated timeline of Welbeck's novel, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then you're like, okay, well, then that means that you have to fight back Islam in the name of something. And so, well, sometimes they say, oh, it's in the name of liberal values. It's like, you know,
Yeah, where has that gotten us? And we've taken, or I've introduced a political turn to the discussion, but Living in Wonder is not a political book. And
yes,
I'm excited when I hear about people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and others who recognize that all the good things, or most of the good things we have in the West, come out of Christianity, and who talk about the need for the culture and the civilization to become re-Christianized. That's all true, but a conversion that is merely instrumental, like we convert because it's good for our civilization, that doesn't really work. What I'm interested in this book is the real conversion, is people making a sincere connection with the living God. And for me in my own life, I was raised in the 1970s in small town Louisiana. Our family went to a Methodist church on Easter and Christmas. My Christianity was merely cultural, and by the time I got to be a teenager, I threw it away. It was boring to me. I thought it was basically the white middle class at prayer. But then when I was 17 years old, you know this story well. My mom won a trip to Europe in a church contest, didn't want to go, sent me because I wanted to get to Paris to go to the museums and see where Hemingway lived and all that. I was the only young person on a bus full of elderly American tourists. We stopped an hour outside the city to go look at an old church. I almost didn't get off the bus because who wants to go see another old church? But I did, and it was the cathedral at Chartres. I walked into that medieval cathedral not knowing anything about it, growing up in late 20th century small town America, and there was God. I didn't have a religious experience per se, but I remember standing in the labyrinth there looking up at the vaults and the stained glass and the rose window, and I was overwhelmed by the presence of God. I somehow knew that God was here and that he wanted to know me, and I wanted to know the God that had inspired men 800 years or so ago to raise such a temple to his glory. I didn't walk out of there as a Christian, but I walked out of there on a search. And it was a search that ended 8 or 9 years later with me becoming a Catholic. Now, um, I think that experience is open to everybody. Not everybody who walks into the cathedral at Chartres converts, obviously, or we would be living in a very different world. But for whatever reason, I was open to it. And that experience of radical beauty bypassed all of my feeble teenage agnostic objections to the faith and pierced my heart. And my mind eventually began to pry open to the arguments for the faith. Many years later, I read that Pope Benedict XVI, as Cardinal Ratzinger, I believe he was when he said this, he said that the best apologetic arguments for the Christian faith today are not the rational ones, not propositional, but rather the art that comes out of the church and the saints. What did he mean by that? He meant that beauty is the thing that will save souls. When you are confronted by radical beauty, like the cathedral at Chartres, or radical moral beauty in the life of a saint, you you can't deny it. I mean, Solzhenitsyn said that beauty cannot be denied. It is real. It is something we perceive. Now, it is not an argument for God necessarily, but it is a pre-argument for God. If I had not had that experience in the Chartres Cathedral, and years later, the thing that finally tipped me over into becoming a Catholic was meeting a holy man, a holy elderly priest who was just radiant, luminous with sanctity. And I realized I've seen it again. I've seen something else here, and I can't. All my objections have to go away. I know what the right thing to do is, and so I converted. In both cases, I saw Christianity made incarnate. I saw it in a way that I was able to perceive it and perceive religious truth in ways that had been hidden to my logical mind. Now, I can't convince someone that, oh yeah, because Rod Dreher felt God at Chartres and then in the presence of Monsignor Carlos Sanchez, therefore you should become a Christian. But what I try to do with this book is help people, help the reader understand that God really is everywhere present and fills all things, as the Orthodox say in our prayers. And they too can find God, but they have to learn how to see for God. There's a quote I use in the opening chapter. A professor at Harvard was talking about education. She said, true education is not imparting information from teacher to student. True education is teaching the students how to be staring at the right corner of the night sky when a comet blazes past. Well, that's my idea of enchantment too. I don't offer a formula for re-enchantment. What I try to do, though, is to help the readers be staring at the right corner of the night sky when signs and wonders pointing to the living God blaze past.
Well, it wouldn't be enchantment if there was a formula to it
Right, right.
by definition, right?
Right. No, no, that's a really good point. I talk in the book about this German sociologist, Hartmut Rosa. I don't know if he's a religious believer, but he has this theory of what he calls resonance. And it's a pretty good analogy for enchantment. He says that when we are at home in the world, we feel some mysterious sense of resonance with the world outside our head. We feel some connection to it. Now, we make that go away when we try to control the world around us. Like you may fall in love with a woman, and there's something mysterious there that causes her to enchant you. But if you turned her into effectively a slave, or you controlled everything about her, she would lose her enchantment. And this is something that the English 19th century Romantic poet William Wordsworth said in a beautiful phrase: "We murder to dissect," meaning to try to dissect something to understand how it works, you have to kill it. And that's what I think too many of us do with religion. We try so hard to parse, to put religion under the microscope and try to understand it theologically. There's nothing wrong with intellectual inquiry about religion, but it's not, knowing about God is not the same thing as knowing God.
So there's one thing you mentioned which was on my notes for this interview, which I wanted to get your take on, which is beauty and beauty as evidence for God. Last week or something like that, I interviewed our friend Ross Douthat, who has a book out on a similar theme to yours, although with a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I wanted to ask him this, but we didn't have time. There's no argument for beauty in his book. There is in yours. And, I remember all of the new atheist controversies and so on and so forth. The argument from beauty is, in my view, one of the most compelling, A, emotionally or personally, and B, sort of metaphysically, because, beauty is a transcendental and blah, blah, blah. Um, every beautiful thing partakes of beauty with a capital B, and if there exists beauty with a capital B, then there exists a sort of transcendent reality, and that reality is God. And yet, it's the hardest to put into words,
Mm-hmm.
and especially to explain to a sort of contemporary secular audience. And this is something that I have struggled with myself. Like I've stared at a blank page
Yeah. Yeah.
with the headline like God and beauty or whatever, or beauty as evidence for the existence of God or whatever, and sort of like, how do I write this? How do I write this in a way that's compelling? How do I write this in a way that's the demonstration and not just oh, look at this beautiful sunset. um so I know beauty is one of the big themes in your book. I read that on the internet. No, but seriously, so how do you approach it? How do you explain it? I'm
Well,
fascinated by that.
yeah. It's a complex thing, and some people have told me, readers of the book, that the beauty chapter was worth the price of the book, and I'm glad of that. Well, we can go into Dante, for example, into the Divine Comedy. Dante was drawn, the character Dante in the poem, who goes through hell, up the mountain of purgatory, and through paradise to the throne of God. He's drawn along by beauty, by the beauty at first of Beatrice, his love. And what we see from that is that beauty draws on our erotic desire, on our eros, on our desire to possess it, desire to participate in whatever that mysterious quality beauty has.
And
And
just to be clear, eros in sort of philosophical language doesn't just mean like erotic
sex,
or
right? Yeah,
sexual.
yeah. Thank you for that. No, it is the form of it means desire philosophically. When Pope Benedict wrote about eros and beauty, and eros as a way to God, this is what he was talking about. That when we allow ourselves to be drawn by desire for beauty, eventually, by analogy, if you do it right, you are drawn ultimately to God, who is the source for all beauty. And this is in the Divine Comedy. This is what the pilgrim Dante learns. Beatrice tells him when they finally meet at the summit of the Mountain of Purgatory at the end of the second book. She tells him, the mistake you made, Dante, in life was placing my beauty as your ultimate end. In fact, God shined through me. You should have seen my beauty as just sort of an icon through which the glory of God shone, and pursued God. And then you would have had all the other things. Now, I'm simplifying it somewhat, but as you know, I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. I converted in 2006 after I lost my Catholic faith. And I've really come to appreciate in Orthodox spirituality, we we see icons not as mere objects, but as windows into the transcendent. And we don't have to get deep into that theology here, but the Orthodox mind, the entire world is iconographic. That I mentioned before, that line, we pray in the morning, we address God, who is everywhere present and fills all things. It's not to say that the trees are God, the river Seine is God, but rather somehow the glory of God comes through that. And this, by the way, is also in Dante. The glory of God shines in greater and lesser ways through the material world. This is sacramentality, the principle of sacramentality. So I think the Catholic mind and the Orthodox mind, the sacramental mind, understands intuitively that beauty is a manifestation of God. And as we purify our minds, purify our souls, we can learn to appreciate it more and more. I think of Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag. And by the way, I should say, when I mean beauty, I don't mean simply aesthetic beauty, but moral beauty and radical goodness. Solzhenitsyn talked about how he went into the Gulag as an atheist, but he came out as a Christian. And one of the things that converted him, perhaps the thing that converted him, was watching how Christians in the Gulag met their suffering. He saw nobility there. He saw ultimate beauty, and its source was their faith in God. This is why Solzhenitsyn was able to write in the Gulag Archipelago those scandalous words, "Bless you, prison," because they brought him to God. That suffering brought him to God. The beauty that emerged from the faith, the sacrificial faith of those Christian inmates, converted Solzhenitsyn's soul. And so this is the kind of thing I mean. It's is the Chartres Cathedral an argument for God? Yeah, it kind of is. But you have to have eyes cultivated to perceive that. And that's one of the reasons I talk in the book. I have a chapter about attention. It turns out that I quote Ian McGilchrist, the great psychiatrist. You need to have him on. He is an incredible man. But he talks about how attention, what we choose to pay attention to and how we choose to attend to it, creates certain realities. Now, he's not talking about manifesting. He's just making this simple psychological point that the things that we focus on are the things that become real to us. And in the modern world, if our attention is radically fragmented, we may never find God because we don't know how to be still and be quiet and look for him.
Okay, so what if I were to tell you, oh, that all sounds very nice, Mr. Rod Dreher, but beauty is subjective. It's just I think something. It's like taste in whether you like mushrooms or not. Some people like some things, some people like other things. It's actually evidence that everything is relative. Uh, what say you to that?
Well, it's actually not. I mean, yes, there are variations in taste, no question about it. But there are studies that have been done that show that across cultures, there are fairly consistent standards for beauty, and they have to do with proportion, mathematical proportion. It's really, really interesting when you dig into this. There's a guy, I quote him in the book,
Yeah, it's
Christopher.
fascinating. Like, tell us more about
Yeah,
that.
what's his name? I can't believe I'm forgetting it now. Christopher. Anyway, he wrote A Pattern Language, the best-selling architecture book in history. Anyway, he talks about how he learned the pattern language as he began to observe why certain buildings and landscapes, quote unquote, worked, why people felt comfortable, why they resonated with them, and why others didn't. And he began, the more he studied this, the more
Christopher Alexander.
Christopher Alexander, thank you. The more he studied this,
This is a low production values podcast, so I'm my own Jamie.
okay, got it.
Jamie, pull it up.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, he discovered that all of the things that people felt, that just ordinary people, he would show them like pictures of certain buildings or arrangements of buildings. Which one do you feel more at home in? Which one gives you a greater sense of peace? They unfailingly selected the ones that had certain proportions, whether it was a modern building, an ancient building, somewhere in between. And so from this, Alexander realized that there are such things as objective principles of beauty that most people will find beautiful. And so it is an objective value. And I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that before he died, he converted and became a Christian because this recognition of deep order embedded in patterns in nature and in the built world was a sign pointing to transcendence and to God.
Okay.
Well, let me back up one more. Ian McGilchrist, in his work, I mean, he writes about the connection between brain hemispheres and culture. He points out that in the modern world, meaning the world of the 20th century, post World War One, the radical fragmentation and loss of order and in art is a sign of schizophrenia or of a latent schizophrenia, that We
Oh,
somehow
that's
have.
fascinating. Can you back up and explain that in detail?
Yeah, yeah. McGilchrist says, and I think he takes this from a psychiatrist named Louis Sass, but he says that if you look at modern art, like art of the 20th century and beyond, that it indicates that there are signs, if you read it as a neuroscientist or as a psychiatrist, you see signs of schizophrenia, of madness, in the radical loss of harmony and the hostility to harmony. I mean, he's not saying that all modern artists are crazy, but McGilchrist says that modern art and artists have lost some deep felt connection to transcendence. And it's not a matter of, for McGilchrist, it's not a matter of losing a sense of morality or losing your religion, but rather it's losing the deep connection that all artists must have to some world beyond that brings order out of chaos. In fact, they choose chaos and declare that to be reality. Uh, Andrei Tarkovsky, the great Soviet filmmaker, he said something similar about art. He said that an artist is not there simply to provide beautiful things to look at, or the artist is there to harrow the soul and to prepare it for death. A very Russian statement, mind you, but what he was getting at is the artist, if he's true to his vocation, is calling us out of ourselves to commune with higher truths. One of my favorite scenes in all of cinema comes in Tarkovsky's film Andrei Rublev, 1966, one of the great films of all time. About halfway through the film, Andrei, who's a medieval Russian iconographer, he's kneeling in the ruins of a cathedral that has been sacked by the Tatars and their Russian allies. All of his art, the icons he put on the wall, have been burned except one. He's in total despair over the suffering and the misery and the sin of humanity. Look what they've done. Then the ghost of his mentor, Theophanes, shows up and to give him hope. And what he basically tells Andre is, you're an artist. Your role is to create beauty that gives people, suffering people, hope, that gives them a vision of the world beyond this world of sin and suffering and death and misery. And you have to be faithful to that vocation. Theophanes points to the one icon that has not been damaged on the wall of the sacked cathedral. It's an icon of the Virgin Mary, which an Orthodox viewer would recognize. It's called Our Lady of Protection, the protecting veil. And the idea is that in this icon that Mary provides a veil of protection over a city that's besieged. What Theophanes is saying there to the artist is, the art that you produce out of your experience of faith is going to be the protecting veil over the hearts of suffering people who are at risk of losing their hope. Tarkovsky said in his great book, Sculpting in Time, it was his memoir about art. I don't know if he was a Christian or not. I think he was, and he wasn't. I don't know what the state of his soul is when he died. But he said that religious truth is a truth that gives us hope. And for Tarkovsky, that was the true artist is someone who is always there, whatever his or her convictions about God, is always someone who gives us hope. And I think, Peg, to go back to our original point here, I think that is the role beauty plays, true beauty, is it gives us hope that there is something beyond this world of chaos and violence and despair. If I can walk into the Chartres Cathedral at 17 as a confused and atheistic teenager and feel in my heart, piercing my heart, this sense that there is something more. And it's not just an abstract something, but it is the living God, then there's hope for anybody.
Okay,
You chortle like a Frenchman.
So, I mean, it's funny. So I discovered this thing about the Gallic shrug. I had no idea that French people shrug in a certain way
You're kidding
until
me. No, you do.
American friends. Yeah. I mean, I the first time I was, somebody said something and I went, and they were like,
That's it.
"Oh, that was a beautiful Gallic shrug," and I was like, "What are you talking about?"
But you got to have the boof too. What do you call it? That's a French thing.
That's That's even funnier because my dog does that. And it's the funniest thing. She's a wonderful Labrador, so very very good dog. But sometimes when you tell her to do something she doesn't want to, especially at night when she has to go to bed, she will sort of go and do it, and then you hear. It's the funniest thing. It's the sweetest thing. Dogs are also an argument for God.
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah.
Both in their being and this is also a very French point that my parents made when I was a kid and sort of stuck with me forever. They didn't say it about dogs; they said it about cows. Cows are proof of the existence of God because uh, cows only find their meaning through man. Right? The purpose of a cow is to produce milk so that man can take the milk and make cheese, obviously, and therefore uh, therefore they're a proof of God's providentiality because cows don't have a purpose apart from man. And I mean, this is something, the breeding of animals and the fact that this is something to point out to environmentalists. Like if we all became vegetarians, putting aside the fact that it would be very unhealthy for us, it would actually lead to the greatest mass death event for animals in the history of planet Earth, because something like 90% of the animals that live on planet Earth were bred by man to be used either for food or for food byproducts. And they can't exist in the wild. So, for example, a sheep, there are you can find newspaper articles about this. A sheep's wool will keep growing and growing if it's not sheared, to the point where the weight kills the animal. Like the heart can't keep up with the weight of the wool on top, and so it dies. And so a sheep literally cannot exist apart from man because it's been bred for its wool, and therefore it's no longer a wild animal. And it's the same thing for cows, the same thing for horses, it's the same thing for dogs. I mean, dogs can sort of live in stray dogs, but you know they're they're clearly not meant. And even stray dogs, they live around civilization, right? They forage our trash and so on and so forth. Dogs don't go back to the forest and live as wolves. They can't. um
Are you
So yeah,
finished, Peg?
so
Are you finished with this
the fact
discourse?
that we have bred, also vegetables, animals, and so on and so forth for our life, is, to my mind, an example of to me, one of the most important theological concepts, which Pope Benedict mentioned, was almost the first thing he mentioned after he became Pope, which is co-creation
Yeah. Yeah.
and being co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord, which is, breeding dogs out of wolves is a kind of creation. It's an icon of God's creation. God creates out of nothing,
Exactly
but
right.
man takes what God has given and creates something new, something beautiful, something ordered. Dogs are ordered, right? They're genetically wired to like us, to do what we say, to be companions, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that was a rant. I don't know where it began, but uh,
Let me draw it back to the whole wonder question. I mean, humanity, is meant to serve a priestly function in that we receive these gifts from God, we transform them with our labor, and then we offer them back to God. This is what, whenever we go to Mass or to the liturgy, and what the priest is doing on the altar is, in a way, what all of us do or should do with our lives, with our creative work. And I think that the global population collapse, which Europe was probably the first to enter into, but now it's everywhere in the world except sub-Saharan Africa. Uh,
and even sub-Saharan Africa, it's crashing. It's just coming down from a very high
yeah,
level.
sure.
I had another podcast, but actually, like, basically relative to income, Africans today have much fewer children than Europeans did when they were equally poor.
Wow. Wow.
That's just
Well,
a sidebar. So it really is happening everywhere.
yeah, and I think it's a sign of secularization. It's even happening in Muslim countries, which you don't think of as secular. But I think that when you cease to believe that children are a primary good, that they are a source, they're a gift from God and a source of wonder and of God's life, and if you cease to believe that our task here on in this life is to reproduce the life of God and through creative works, above all, having children, things fall apart. And I think we're living through that now, that there is a sacred dimension or a desacralizing dimension to the population crisis.
Yeah, I mean, having children is a perfect example of um, meaning and the link between creation and achievement and meaning, in the sense that children are wonderful and so on and so forth, but they're also a pain in the ass. And economically, they're a pretty big cost. And so, the calculus of whether to have a child or not, you know, it needs that extra bit. It's not just purely rational. For some people it is, because the joy they have of a child is worth more to them than the problems. What we see at the collective level is that most of the time you need that extra source of meaning. You need the sense that you're having children because God wants you to, because God loves them, because you're sharing in God's design and you're sharing
Hmm.
in God's plan by having children. And there's this very famous study on, because France was the first country to go through what's known as demographic transition. There's this famous study of 18th century France where they find that the drop in birth rates at the local level tracks secularization perfectly.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
in the 19th century, the joke in France was that the French were the most intelligent people in the world because they invented pulling out. Uh,
Well, I was thinking about this just this morning. I was writing a piece about the depopulation. Um, in 1999, my then wife and I were getting ready to welcome our firstborn, and my sister down, we were living in New York. My sister down in Louisiana she was married. She had two kids already. She said, 2 weeks before the baby was born, our baby, she said, listen, you know that you and your wife are about to lose all of your freedom and that it's going to be a cost. It's going to be a sacrifice. What you don't know now, but you soon will, as soon as when you hold the baby in your arms, is that the sacrifice will have brought you joy that you can't even measure. I'm just telling you that's coming. Well, she was absolutely right. But that is a very difficult thing to convey to people, married couples and even singles, who are told you're going to have to make this huge sacrifice, but it's going to be worth it. All the things you'll have to pay financially in terms of your autonomy, etc. Trust me, it's going to be worth it. They can't comprehend that because I think in the United States, at least, my ex-wife and I were probably the last generation of people raised to think that having children is a primary good, meaning that you don't even have to think about it. Of course, you have kids because kids don't need to be justified. Well, now people think they do. People in modern times, even people who profess belief in God, but they do a cost benefit analysis. And it's not simply about, how much money is this going to cost me, but how is this going to hamper my autonomy? What are the opportunity costs for me to have fun and find self fulfillment by having children? When that plays into it, you get what we have today. And I think ultimately it's a religious problem, not religious in the sense of, oh, for example, Catholics aren't paying attention to what the church says. I think it's deeper than that. I think that it goes down to a loss of belief in transcendence. I think it goes back to what Philip Reef was saying, that we live in the age of the therapeutic, where even religion, Christianity, has become moralistic therapeutic deism, to use the phrase of Christian Smith, the sociologist of religion at Notre Dame. Which is to say, people began to think of God as the cosmic sugar daddy who only wants us to be happy and nice to others, and there's no deeper purpose. I think there's no accident that you still see fecundity among religious people like traditional Catholics and the Amish and people like that who have a very strong sense of a connection to divine purpose in family life. And here in Hungary, Viktor Orban, the prime minister, has just announced a radical new benefit for families. They're introducing legislation that will take away the income tax for life from women who have two or more children. I think that's great. I'm all for pronatalism, but I think that politics in that sense are necessary for regrowing the population, but they're not sufficient. You have to have a cultural sense. You look at the country of Georgia. They really turned things around for themselves. They went from like 1.5 children per woman to 2.2. Now they're down to 2.0, which is just below replacement. They did it when the government came up with pronatalist policies to make it easier financially for families to have kids. But the key thing was the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. He went whole hog behind promoting families. He said, anybody who has a child, I'll baptize the child myself. And it worked. This tells me that there has to be a recovery of a sense of wonder and wonder in family life in order for there to be a greater recovery. That's I don't write about family in the book Living in Wonder, but it's all part of the same thing. It's all part of the recovery of a sense that we are part of a grand cosmic drama that is going on all around us. And we can participate in God's life in that way, but we can't just sit back and wait for it to come to us, or just do the Gallic shrug and say, well, God's gone, not much to do. I had coffee once when I was in France in 2018 promoting the French edition of the Benedict option. I had coffee with Alain Finkielkraut, the great Jewish secular intellectual. And we were both complaining about the Islamization of France, the failure of the Republic, all of these things. And I looked at him and said, so where do you find hope? He Gallic shrugged and said, I don't have hope. I said, well, I do have hope, and my hope comes from Jesus Christ.
That is very Finkelkraut.
Yeah,
He's a great man, but he's deeply pessimistic.
yeah. And I said, well, I do have hope, and my hope comes from Jesus Christ. Now, let me tell you, I'm not saying that to you like some TV evangelist. I'm a pessimist too about the short term for our culture. But my Christian faith tells me that God is real and that God is good, and that even if we suffer well and offer our suffering to Him for His purposes, that He can draw good out of it, that our suffering has meaning. And Finkelkraut listened to me patiently and respectfully. Then he said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, God is dead. And I thought, wow, he has no capacity for wonder. If he walked into the Chartres Cathedral, he can see it as a beautiful piece of architecture, as maybe a historical landmark, but not as an icon of God, because he has closed off in his mind even the possibility that God exists.
I mean, this is to my mind, God is more alive in France than in America because, and I know this isn't true everywhere, but as you were saying about moral therapeutic deism, American faith, A, is in decline objectively in terms of numbers, but B, it sort of feels very thin. Whereas in France, we're on the other side where it's a small number of people, but the people who do have faith are sort of very well catechized and
Mm-hmm.
very sort of it's deeply rooted. But this is just my French arrogance. Another
No,
thing is, so given the wonderful state of American publishing today, every book has to be either a memoir or a self-help book, because those are the two most narcissistic genres. So does the book have practical advice for somebody who's, I hate that term, but who's a religious seeker, somebody who senses that there is something there but doesn't know where to start?
yeah, yeah, it does. because I'm not a theologian, I'm a journalist, and the first thing that we can do is change our mind, metanoia. What I mean by that is people might find it really interesting to learn about the whole weird hypothesis. You know what I'm talking about, right? Capital
Yes.
WEIRD. So about 20 years ago, psychologists discovered that what we all thought was the baseline for human psychology was, in fact, just a Western construct, that the psychology of peoples outside the West was rather different. And one of these differences is they were far more open to things of the spirit, to numinous things. Weird means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Well, once you read about that, and Joe Henrich, who's a Harvard anthropologist, he was one of the leaders in this hypothesis. Once you read about that and realize that this secularism, this atheism that is all around us, it's not universal. This is only, we're the strangest people on the planet today, and even strangers to the long history of our ancestors. So if you realize that this is not how the world is, it's just a certain take on the world, then you can move beyond it. Then you can set it aside and go in search of of the experience that most people around the world, even today, have of God. There are also things you can do in terms of practicing attention, changing the way you attend to things, and stopping doing certain things, start doing other things. You can learn through prayer, through disciplined prayer.
Talk more about this attention shifting thing
Yeah,
while I play Angry Birds on my phone.
yeah. Well, the more we allow our attention to be fragmented by being drawn here, there, and everywhere, and look, I'm talking about myself too. I'm online all day. The less able we are to be still and hear God's voice and feel God's presence. I'll give you a practical example. Back in 2012, I came down with chronic mononucleosis. I had mono for 3 years, and my rheumatologist said it's because of great stress. I was going through all this conflict with my family in Louisiana, and my priest at the time assigned me to say the Jesus prayer 500 times a day. Well, the Jesus prayer is a famous in Orthodox spirituality. It's very simple. You say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But if you pray it in the correct way as an Orthodox Christian, you make yourself very still, you clear your mind as best you can. When you pray silently, you breathe in on Lord Jesus Christ, breathe out, Son of God, breathe in, have mercy on me, breathe out, a sinner. What this does, I mean, it's just words, right? But what this does, the breathing and the words and the clearing of the mind, if you do it diligently, it it brings real stillness to you. Now, this 500 Jesus prayers a day is about an hour of intense meditative prayer. Peg, even as sick as I was, it would have been easier to walk 6 miles into town than to be still enough to do that. But I pushed through it out of obedience. And I noticed after a couple of months of this, I was feeling better. I was, the anxiety that was around me that was taking my attention, it began to lessen. Finally, I was healed. And it wasn't just that, it was also reading Dante. But when I was healed of it, I asked my priest, how did you know that's what I needed? He said, it was simple. I had to get you out of your head. Well, that's a practical thing that everybody can do. Pray the Jesus prayer, but pray it in that meditative way. Because what happened, not only did it make me overall calmer on the inside, but I believe that it opened up a pathway for the Holy Spirit to heal my troubled heart. That might sound like theological, chit chat, but I think there's a real psychological benefit there to learning how to focus our attention. In fact, it's necessary. Ian McGilchrist talks about this. I quote him in the book, and Matthew B. Crawford, the American philosopher, talks about this too, about doing things with our hands. There's a English anthropologist. He was a Marxist, but he said some really interesting things. A guy named Paul Connerton. He set out to study how traditional cultures, microcultures, had managed to hold on to their identity in modernity, and which famously destroys all tradition. And he studied a variety of different cultures and said that they all had certain things in common. One, They had a sacred story that they shared. They believed this story told them who they are and what they're supposed to do. Second, they celebrated this sacred story in an unvarying ritual. Third, there was a sense among them all when they were in this ritual that they were somehow connected to eternity, taken out of time. And finally, I think this is the most important thing, they used their bodies when they were worshiping in this way, because Connerton said using your body in the sacred liturgy sediments the narrative into the bones. Now, you're listening to me say this, and you're a Catholic. You know this is what Catholics do, traditional Catholics
Oh
do.
yeah,
This is what
100%.
Orthodox do. And these are practical things people can do to learn, to train themselves in their bodies and in their minds to be open to wonder. You can't force it to happen, but if you pray the Jesus prayer, and go to the liturgy, go to the mass, and do it attentively, not just with your mind elsewhere, but try to pay attention and surrender your attention to what's happening on the altar and all around you, then if you're patient over time, it will open you up to being able to perceive God's presence all around you. Now, one thing I do write about in the book is that and this was a real shock to me to discover it in my research, but the younger generation doesn't care about atheism generally. But they don't really, not interested in Christianity either. They're interested in the occult. I'm talking about the U.S. and the U.K. I don't know about France.
No, this is a very. I mean, I don't know about France either, but yes, it's a very real trend in the U.S.
Yeah. Because what people are interested in, the young, are they're interested in an experience of wonder, of mystery, of woo, but they don't want to surrender to it. They don't want to surrender to God. They want to be able to keep their own autonomy and still have these cool experiences. This is one reason why ayahuasca and other psychedelics are so popular now, and also the occult. And I think this is something the churches simply aren't ready for. If you talk to exorcists in the US, for example, they will tell you they're doing a land office business. There's so much need for exorcism because so many people are giving themselves over to tarot cards or more intense paganism, and they are finding they've bitten off way more than they can chew. This is a form of enchantment too. I call it dark enchantment in the book, but you can't have the good side of enchantment, miracles, the presence of angels, things like that, uh, without also opening yourself up to the dark side. And we have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna, in case some of the viewers are sort of rolling their eyes. I just finished reading a book which I'm sure you've at least heard of, which is Demonic Foes, and this is by this guy who's professor of psychiatry, I believe, at Yale or Columbia. So very very serious guy who was a sort of humanistic skeptic and was essentially recruited to work as a consultant to Catholic exorcists. And after doing these for a number of years and watching a number of cases, he became convinced that there are cases that are not explicable by psychiatry, right? That there are people who say they're afflicted by demons or who say they're possessed and are possessed, and their cases are not psychiatrically explainable. They don't have a mental illness. Number one, and number two, that he witnessed and many other people witnessed, supernatural things like levitations and so on and so forth. So there's real evidence that the demonic there's real serious sort of sociological and witness evidence that the demonic is real, whatever you make of it.
Yeah, I
I
tell.
just to sort of underscore or point out that you don't have to be a religious believer to think that there's something there and
Yeah,
to sort of admit that there are, very weird things going on. And one of the things that shocked me reading the book was the extent to which people who were afflicted or possessed had a history of the occult. And I sort of, I'm a religious believer, but I never thought that, if you do a Ouija board or whatever with your friends for a laugh, you're not actually like committing yourself to Satan or something like that. You're just doing a stupid thing. But no, it turns out that obviously not in every case, but in a striking number of cases, it's doing shit like this that actually opens a door for demons. That's just the technical term. So it's a very real thing. And then the sociological phenomenon, witches putting a hex on Brett Kavanaugh, and all this stuff, and astrology and all of that. Like it's also a real sociological phenomenon in the United States that you have a lot more young people, particularly young women, getting interested in the
Yeah.
occult.
Well, I tell a story in the book about, well, I went down to Rome to speak to an exorcist in the Vatican about the stuff he's done and stuff he sees. And, a lot of people, they just kind of have to see it to believe it. And I've seen some of this stuff with my own eyes. In fact, I went down to Rome from Budapest for Pope Benedict's funeral a couple of years ago because he was a real hero of mine. And I woke up the morning in my hotel room. The story is in Living in Wonder, by the way, but I'll tell it for the listeners who won't get the book. I woke up in my
They
hotel
will
room.
all get the book.
They'll all
I'll
get
make
the
sure of
book,
it.
all right. But here's a little preview then. I woke up in my hotel room before dawn. I wanted to get down to St. Peter's Square to make sure I got a good place. I got dressed. I was fixing my scarf when I heard this crash behind me. I whirled around, and my desk chair was lying in a pile on the floor. There was nothing on that chair. It was a metal chair. It wasn't like weak wood or anything, but there it was in a heap on the floor with the pipes all, the leather frame, I'm sorry, the metal frame all twisted up. And I noticed it closely. There was a bolt I saw as thick as my finger that had been sheared in two. I thought, what the hell is that? But I didn't have time to think about it because I was running late. So I left and went down to St. Peter's Square, took my place, and then finally the funeral started. Pope Francis comes out and he gives this terrible homily that I thought was just extremely disrespectful to Pope Benedict. It was
Yes,
appalling.
yes.
I was so offended and angry. Well, I ended up that afternoon around 1:30 or 2. I met a couple of journalist friends who were there covering the event. I met them for lunch at a restaurant in Vatican City. And we were just talking about how shocked we were by what we had seen and heard from Pope Francis. Then I mentioned, after a bottle of wine, I mentioned what happened that morning in my hotel room and how strange it was. As I finished the story, Peg, there was one chair at the table that no one was sitting in. It flips over backwards. Nobody was touching it, no one was near it. Everybody felt quiet. When we left lunch, I texted my exorcist friend in the Vatican, told him what had happened in my hotel room that morning and then what had just happened in front of the journalist. I said, what do you make of that? And he said, that's just the enemy letting you know you're on his territory and he's watching you. Okay, so that's just an anecdote, but there's no explanation for either of those things, right? I have an explanation as a Christian, but if you're a materialist, you've got to account for that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's troubling, and the book has this quote from C.S. Lewis, which is, a total lack of interest in the occult is unhealthy, but so is like a strong interest in the occult.
Yeah.
So you don't want to think about it too much.
No, 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 you don't.
Um,
You don't. You draw it to you. And was that book you read, Demonic Foes, was that by Richard Gallagher by chance? The
yes,
Okay, good. Here's where he intersects with my book. The story in Living in Wonder about Nathan and Emma, the name I give to these two Catholic friends on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I knew them when I lived in New York 25 years ago. Very faithful Catholics, very conservative in their politics and their religion, involved in Catholic activism and so forth. I lost faith. I lost touch with Nathan and Emma after I left New York, but around 2017 or so, 2018, I get a call from Nathan one day. I hadn't heard from him in years. And he said, I was praying last night and I felt I needed to call and let you know what's going on. What? He said, Emma is possessed. I said, wait, I'm sorry. What? Because these are holy people, right? He said, yeah, yeah, yeah. And he tells me this story. I won't recount the whole thing here. It's in the book. But
By the
she,
book.
yeah, well, it turns out that she had tried to kill herself after the birth of one of their children and nearly succeeded. After she got out of the hospital, the nun took her to a healing mass with a priest who had a gift of healing, and these voices started coming out of her, and that's how they knew they were dealing with something. Make a long story short, she ended up applying for a formal exorcism with the archdiocese, and the Catholic Church is really good about this. They insist, before they will approve any of this, that the potential exorcee be seen by a psychiatrist, this guy Richard
Right.
Gallagher.
Exactly.
Gallagher was her psychiatrist, right? And he said, we can't explain what's going on with her. So he approved an exorcism. Well, for whatever reason, she never got the formal ritual exorcism, but she had a priest who was helping her do everything up to the point of exorcism. That's permitted by the church. And it turns out that she had a grandfather back in Italy who had been a very high level Freemason who had been deeply involved in the occult. And in some way that we can't really understand, he brought a curse onto the family, and it had played out in every generation. The thing that finally delivered her from this, most of all, was not a formal exorcism, but um, the priest said, after years of dealing with this, he said, listen, you were baptized in Italy around 1970, right after the Second Vatican Council. There was a lot of funny business going on. You might not have been baptized according to the Trinitarian formula. So let's do a conditional baptism just in case. She submitted to that. It took care of 90% of the problem right there. So that tells you that the baptism is not simply words, something significant
Yes, of
happens.
course.
And as I talk about in the book, before all this, I was in New York on business and went over to see them in their high-rise apartment on the Upper East Side. Fancy people, right? And they manifested. Her husband Nathan told me, he said, "I'm gonna." Before we went into the apartment, he said, "At some point, I'm gonna go get some lemonade or whatever, and I'm gonna put into my pocket a relic the priest gave me. I'm not. She doesn't know I'm going to do this. Watch what happens." So he excuses himself. Emma and I are in the middle of conversation. When he comes and sets a lemonade down, she cuts herself off mid sentence. Her chin drops to her chest. When she lifts up her face, Peg, it was not her face. There was something else inside her. She growled at her husband and said, "I told you to keep that effing thing away from me." Her head drops again, chin to the chest. She picks it up. It's Emma again. And she had this incredibly pained look on her face. She said, "I'm so sorry. That's not me." I said, "I know, I know." When Nathan was walking me back to my hotel that night, I said, "Dude, you're a stockbroker. I mean, how has this changed your way of seeing the world? I mean, I know you're a Catholic, but most Catholics don't deal with this." He said, "Rod, when I walk down the streets of Manhattan now, I realize that there is an immense spiritual battle going on all around. We just can't see it, but it's there." And that's one of I put that story in the book to make people realize it's happening. You may not want to recognize that it's happening, but for people who have been suddenly immersed in it, as this couple was, and were seen by Dr. Richard Gallagher, a psychiatrist, who said, "Yeah, we can't explain this. You need an exorcism." Attention must be paid.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things from Gallagher's book, which I strongly recommend, although don't buy it before you've bought Rod's book, because Gallagher's retired now, he doesn't need the money. Is so I talked about people being involved in the occult, but there's the other extreme, which is very holy people, and we know this from the lives of saints. But he also tells a few of these stories of, you know, particularly women who are harassed or possessed by demons, and he sort of like tries to figure out the source, because usually there's a source, and the source is just that this is a very holy person who just does good around her and is just a wonderful person, and demons hate that, and they essentially try to bully people like that away from the path of holiness. And it's an important point to him because he. there's this sense, and particularly in sort of traditional communities, that if you have a problem like this, it's because you did something wrong. You
Right.
must have done something wrong to bring it upon yourself, and sometimes that's true.
Well,
Sometimes it's
Padre
not.
Pio, Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, he was constantly being attacked in his cell by the demons, and he was a
Yeah,
saint.
and Saint John Vianney, the cure of Ars, he, like, his entire house would, like, everything in his house, every piece of furniture would, like, fly and, like, attack him.
Well, but one of the things I do in the book too, Peg, and I know we're running out of time here, but I try to I bring contemporary stories of good things happening to people. My favorite one is the story of this young man, Stefano, a Roman guy from Rome. Uh, he was raised in a communist family, hardcore communist atheist, and he grew up to be a blasphemer in high school. When he went to college at Rome, he started meeting Christians, and he found that he really liked them and wanted to be like them, but he didn't know what to do with himself. And one day, it was near Christmas, he and his cousin were driving through Rome. They were going to a party, and they parked the car. They got out, and they noticed a homeless man sitting on the other side of the street who was looking very strangely at Stefano. The homeless man rises up, walks over, looks at him, and says, "Stefano, I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. From this day forward, you won't be afraid of anything. You will belong to Jesus Christ." And then the homeless man started telling Stefano about all of his secret sins and fears and things. Stefano told me, he said, I started sobbing. I like, who are you? Stefano told me, if my cousin hadn't been standing there listening and seeing all this, I would have thought it was a hallucination. He said, Stefano said, I said to him, "Are you an angel?" And he just smiled. I said, "Well, who are you?" He said, "You can call me Felice di Natale, the happiness of Christmas." Then Felice di Natale fell to his knees, raised his hands, and began praising God. And he said the Our Father, but Stefano said after each line of the Our Father, he would add these fulsome praises of the Holy Trinity in beautiful Italian. When he finished, he stood up, bowed, walked away, and disappeared. Well, Stefano converted, and he eventually converted his entire family, even his hardcore commie father on his deathbed. And that's how the story ends in my book. But I was able to touch base with Stefano a couple of months ago, and he said, there's more to the story. I realized later that I went down to some church in that same neighborhood, and I looked on the facade of the church. It was a modern church, and there was Felice di Natale. It was Saint Felix. It was like a 15th or 16th century Dominican. No, not Dominican. I forget the order. Anyway, he was an order priest who was known for his devotion to Christmas. And there is a belief, or one of the legends about him was in one of his visions in church, Mary appeared and handed the Christ child to him. He lived, there was a church in that neighborhood devoted to him. When Stefano saw the face of this man, he said, "That's Felice di Natale." It was a saint who and he was known in his time around Rome. He was a holy man, beloved in Rome. He was known for looking like a beggar because he would go around begging for alms. And I ended up going to the church. I forget the name of the order. Archbishop Chaput in America.
I don't know
All right,
him
but
personally,
it's
but I know
his
who he is.
order. I can't believe I'm
Franciscan.
not
It's
Franciscan.
Capuchin.
Capuchin, yeah, he was a Capuchin. Felice di Natale was a Capuchin. I went to the Capuchin church when I was in Rome this past Christmas, where Saint Felix was, and I prayed at his tomb. And they have over his tomb a painting of him receiving the Christ child in his hands from Mary. It's so beautiful. I mean, I get a chill thinking about it, but that's how that story ends.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very good place to end our conversation. There's many, many more things we could talk about. I To the listeners, I swear I'm not trying to make every podcast divert into a discussion of demons. It's I swear it's not on purpose, but as we said, it's a real thing, or at least there is significant evidence that should lead any open-minded, rational person to believe that there's something going on in there that the sort of average tools of sort of modern rationality can't explain. And there is a sociological phenomenon going on in the US right now. So, bracketing that, we have a traditional question that we ask all of our listeners, all of our guests every time, which is recommend a book. Any book, can be modern, old, fiction, nonfiction, that's not in your area of expertise.
Oh, wow. Well, I just read an amazing book, a novel. I don't read a lot of fiction at all, but I read a famous 1953 science fiction novel called Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. And it's a novel about aliens who come to Earth to save humanity from nuclear destruction. And what you learn over the course of the book is they are there to prepare humanity. And they won't reveal themselves to humanity until all of religion is removed from the world. Now, Clarke seems to think this has a happy ending. I'm not going to spoil the ending, even though the book is very old. But the reason this book was recommended to me is because by a reader of my Substack, is that I talk about in Living in Wonder about the role of the occult in the whole UFO world, and UFO, UAP, NHI is false enchantment. I thought all this was nonsense, total nonsense, until 2 years ago, a friend of mine who's a Vatican journalist, one of the guys who was at the table that day when the chair flipped over, he said, "Look, I know you laugh at the whole UFO thing, but you need to pay attention because it's more serious than you realize, and there's a deep religious angle here." So I said, "All right, fine." And I started reading, and I realized, no, he's on to something. And there are people I discovered in working on my book, people very high up in Silicon Valley and in the US government, who take this stuff incredibly seriously, but they don't believe these are creatures from other planets. They believe that these are some sort of transdimensional non-human intelligences. Now, your listeners are like, okay, he's totally lost it. I'm with you. I'm with you. I thought the same thing. But I recently, and by the time this comes out, the story may be out. I recently talked to a friend of mine who is a journalist for a major American magazine, not a believer. He's an atheist materialist. He started working on a story about UFO cults. There are people in America, like the Raelians in your country. They believe that the UFOs or higher intelligences come to enlighten us and save us. A friend of his got into one of these. And so my journalist friend said, "What the hell? What's going on here?" He ended up going, my journalist friend, because he works for a major magazine, he got entree into some pretty high levels in the US government, in the military, intelligence services, and in Congress. And he said, all of them said, yeah, this stuff is real. This UFO, UAP stuff is real, but they're not creatures from other planets. They're, in fact, some sort of transdimensional beings. He said, I asked them, "Why are you telling me this? Why are you revealing this to me?" They told him, "Oh, we tell journalists this when they ask, but they never report it." I'm only saying that, Peg, to point out to your listeners that, again, attention must be paid. This is crazy, wild shit. It is. But this is part of the re-enchantment of the world. The world is being re-enchanted, whether we want it to or not. A friend of mine, probably yours too. Do you know John Asconis at Catholic U in Washington?
I know him a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he told Mark Andreessen, the Silicon Valley oligarch, he told him that, and Mark brought this up on a Joe Rogan podcast recently. He said that a medieval peasant would be better able to navigate psychologically the world that is fast coming into being than a modern person. The
Right.
reason for that is and I asked John about this. Can you explain that? He said, yeah, the medieval peasant believed that there were all around him intelligences that were not necessarily human, that could be a threat to them, but could be navigated through if you did the right things. Well, this is not John talking about demons. He's talking about artificial intelligence. And he
Yeah.
said that the medieval psychology is much better able to comprehend and to contend with these things than we are in modernity. So whether you believe in God or not, you had better reacquaint yourself with the with the meaning of re-enchantment, because we are moving into an enchanted world and we're already there. I brought up childhood Zen because, as I said, I never read fiction. I very rarely read fiction. But this is a scenario in which the so-called aliens show up, and they do not mean us well, even though they bring good things to us. This gave me an insight into how all this might go down, if in fact it does go down, if there is something real here. Last point, I was at the art conference in London recently, and ran into Eric Weinstein. You know, he's the eighth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Weinstein was there, and he's an atheist, physicist, runs Teal Capital, and he has gotten red pilled on the UAP UFO stuff. And even though he's an atheist, and because he started talking to whistleblowers, and I said to him, "All right, so what do you think is really going on there?" He got very guarded, and he said, "Well, I can tell you this much: the decision tree has gotten down to two choices. One, this is either some massive, multi-generational, incredibly expensive government psyop for whatever reason, we don't know, or it's real, that there are these beings and creatures. But there's no middle ground left, according to Eric, that you can't say, well, no, this is a hoax. There's something going on there. He's an atheist and a scientist and believes that attention must be paid. I would say the same to your listeners. And reading Childhood's End was, for me, it helped put me in a more sociological frame of mind about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so Clark, I can't comment on the UFO stuff because I sort of force myself to not pay attention to it.
Yeah, keep your sanity, brother.
To sort of preserve my sanity or what's left of it. But Clark, I mean, he was an atheist. His most famous book is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is a very good book, which is very different from the movie. And he was a sort of god haunted figures. Like, he's got a bunch of stories with like space Jesuits, about like space Jesuits going to evangelize alien civilizations. There's a very good story about a Jesuit astronomer, which of course there are many, and there have always been since the birth of astronomy as a science, sort of studying the explosion of a star that happened a long time ago, and he calculates that the star exploded basically at the time that Jesus would have been born. So it was the Star of Bethlehem.
Mm.
But he also finds out that when the star exploded, it destroyed a planet around it that had civilization on it. And so he's sort of confronted with this problem of like God, destroying one civilization to sort of give a sign in the other civilization or something like that. So he was wrestling with this stuff in his writing.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I can end on this. There's a book you might not have seen, but for listeners who are curious, it's called They Flew, Flew. They Flew. It's by a Yale historian. Have you read
it? I've read like 2/3 of it.
Yeah, by Yale historian Carlos Eire, Eire, who writes about the things he found in the archives in Spain during the Counter-Reformation. Hundreds of testimonies signed by many people who claim to have witnessed.
Oh yeah, the evidence is staggering.
Yeah, witnessed levitation, priests, nuns, holy people levitating. Now, Ari says that Iyer, I don't know how you say his name, says that we don't know why it happened, we don't know why it stopped, but he said there's no other area of historical inquiry that we today would just completely dismiss such a massive amount of documented evidence of people putting their names on it, saying, "I saw this happened." Other than religion. He said that we have bracketed in modernity religion out as nonsense, and we reject, we professional historians reject any testimony from religion. That, says Irie, has to end. We have to get out of this iron cage of rationality, this epistemological cage that prevents us from seeing aspects of reality and real experience that we can't account for with our enlightenment rationality, but nevertheless, they happen. They flew.
Yeah, no, that book is a trip. Everyone should almost literally everyone should read it, because it is the closest thing to an LSD trip that you can get from a book of academic history. Like, it is wild. The overwhelming amount of evidence of uh numerous Catholic saints and nuns and monks flying, and again, hundreds of testimonies from lots of different people, blah 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 blah. Like, the good thing about the Catholic Church is very good at record keeping.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so it's wild. Very good place to end here. Thank you very much for your time, Rod. People should buy Living in Wonder first, and they should even read it. And they should also buy all of the other books we've discussed, but they should buy your book first. Thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun, as always.
Great. Thanks, Peg. See you in Paris soon over oysters.
I hope so. Bye bye.